Präsentation und dann für die Diskussion. Genau. Dankeschön.
Already done.
Yes, welcome to our Bruegel event on a new carbon pricing paradigm for the path to net zero. And we will have about a bit more than an hour to introduce a new paper co-authored by colleagues from the Potsdam Institute for Climate and Bruegel authors. And we will then try to, after the introduction of the paper, discuss it with a great panel and hope that helps us to unleash a debate on a topic that will be with us for probably the better half of this year, which is the reform of the emission trading system in the European Union, its extensions, which role it has to play, and how it can be made one of the core pillars of the European climate architecture. The paper is already on our website, so you can find it there. The paper is called "A Whole Economy Carbon Price for Europe and How to Get There." So I encourage you all to download it and have a look to see a bit in more detail what we've been doing there. And moreover, I encourage you all to go to Slido, which is a discussion tool for online events. The web address is sli.do, so sli.do, and then you type in the hashtag ETS, and then you get to the discussion of our events. So in this tool, you will be able to post questions to the speakers, to the authors. I think our co-authors of the paper are already on Slido and will be happy also to provide detailed answers and more background on what we have been doing. Now, what we want to do now is that we will start with a 15 minutes presentation of the paper by Professor Ottmar Edenhofer. And then based on this input, we'll have a panel discussion, and I'll introduce the speakers then during the panel discussion. So the presentation will be done by one of the authors of the paper, Ottmar Edenhofer, who is, among many other things, the director of two leading climate policy institutes, one in Potsdam, the PIC, and one in Berlin, the MCC. And he's also professor at the Technical University Berlin. So Ottmar, I would immediately hand over to you to introduce the paper, and yeah, looking forward.
Okay, can you see the paper, the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, good. Yeah, thanks a lot, Georg. And it's a pleasure to present our paper in order to advocate that the whole economy carbon price is something which is worthwhile to consider deeply for the transformation and for the implementation of the European Green Deal. And here I would like to refer to my three co-authors, Georg Zachmann from Bruegel, Michael Pali and Miriam Kosch from the Potsdam Institute. And this was a great experience to put this paper together. Now, the starting point of our paper is that we would like to characterize the Green Deal and the minus 55% target as a real paradigm shift for Europe. Because it's not just the 2030 target, it is in particular the 2050 target of carbon neutrality, which is unprecedented, I would say, in European climate policy, and requires not just a debate about goals, it requires a debate about institution and about the underlying policy instruments. And as you might know, that Ursula von der Leyen, she highlighted in her union speech that EU extension raises question for the future role of carbon prices, and she highlighted that the emission trading scheme, including possible extension, is now on the table and at the agenda of the EU Commission. Now, it is fair to say that in the past, carbon pricing definitely played a role, but carbon pricing played only a role as a backstop mechanism. What you can see here is quite obvious for all of us that we had a very low price level, except in the recent years because of the market stability reserve and because of the expectations of user scarcities. We had extensive complementary policies of the member states, which have also reduced the carbon price, and also important sectors are not included so far. So the carbon price served as a backstop mechanism. And the crucial question is, so what would be a reasonable way to make the carbon price to a centerpiece? And in particular, why it is important to go for a new paradigm. The first aspect here and the first component is, it's the goal which we want to achieve, carbon neutrality. Carbon neutrality means a transformation of all the relevant sector, not just of the power sector and the industry sector, but also the transport, heating, building, and agriculture. This is a transformation process which includes all the relevant sectors, the whole economy. And it is very unlikely that performance standards or direct regulatory measures can provide and can deliver the transformation of the whole economy. So that's the first thing. It's the sheer effectiveness and the ambition of our goal. The second aspect is its efficiency, cost efficiency. Cost efficiency will become much more important in the future because of the enormous ambition and because of this transformation pathway. And the third aspect here is Europe cannot deliver alone the Paris Agreement. This is an obvious thing to say. And therefore, we need international cooperation with the United States, with China. And for that, we need also an institutional structure which could help us to facilitate international cooperation. And we feel that carbon pricing as the centerpiece could help also to facilitate international cooperation. Of course, you might think this is the typical first best discussion economists always like. They like to characterize the carbon price as the first best solution, but we know that we are not living in the first best world, so we have to take into account further considerations. The first one is market readiness. It takes time to establish a carbon pricing scheme. It takes time to establish an emission trading scheme. In particular, in the European context, we have to take into account social equity concerns. When we put the price in the transport sector, in the building sector, in the heating sector, it's not the industry which is impacted primarily, it's other consumers. And therefore, equity concerns are important. But also when we would have just one comprehensive emission trading scheme in Europe, the division of labor on the one hand between industry and the power sector and the other sectors would deliver probably cost-efficient results, but results which are not consistent with the equity consideration, fairness considerations across the sectors. There's a commitment problem. Long-term carbon prices requires a commitment of the policymakers. This might very complicated to be implemented, and also other externalities has to be taken into account, in particular in the transport sector. Therefore, our proposed solution is to go for two separate ETS systems and to use the carbon price as an amplifier. This is one role, and I explain in a minute what we mean with the carbon price amplifier. The second aspect is when we have two separate systems, we have to deal with possibly large price differences. This could be very demanding for policymakers to live and to handle in the two separate systems very large-scale price differentials. And secondly, when we talk about the carbon price amplifiers, when we include additional policy instrument, they might overlap, and this could depress the ETS prices, an experience we made so far over the last 10 years. And therefore, we suggest here to implement a carbon price balancer and a carbon price stabilizer. And let me explain what we have in mind with that. Let me start with the carbon price balancer, which is required because of the two ETS. So we start with the two separate ETS systems, And then basically we might allow in the short term with the carbon price balancer that both systems could be linked. We create gateways, so to say, with the two systems, which should allow the policymakers, even in the short run, to deal with this carbon price differentials, and to manage the price differences, at least in the short run. But this is only one aspect here and one institutional component which might allow to handle this problem. The other problem is we have to deal with the long-term convergence. And it could be the case, and it is very easy to understand, that when the traders in the market expect after 2030 a unified ETS system, so this could lead immediately to a strong convergence in the prices. And therefore, we need a carbon price stabilizer. And what we mean with a carbon price stabilizer, we mean basically in both systems a price collar in order to address on the one hand the commitment problem and also to ensure the price convergence in an orderly manner. That's very important because orderly manner matters here, so that investors can then stabilize their expectations along this price collars in the two systems. And then we need carbon price amplifiers. What does it mean? So we have to trigger fast investments and innovation. And we know when carbon prices cannot increase sufficiently, when there is no commitment. So we need additional policy instruments, in particular to incentivize investments and innovation, and not just the dealing and influencing the operational costs. And this carbon price amplifier can be characterized as policy instruments which are complementary, should be complementary to the carbon price. There's a long debate about the complementary instruments, and many people say, yes, you always need a policy mix. It's needless to say, of course we need a policy mix, but the crucial thing should be that the policy mix should be really complementary, and the policy instrument should not cancel out each other. And therefore we suggest here three criteria. First, whenever we want to implement a complementary measure, there should be a direct link to carbon pricing. It should be a clear reference to the emissions, and there should be a kind of a competitive element, so to say, when carbon prices are increasing, then the complementary instrument should be phased out step by step. Of course, the renewable energy support schemes, they had some advantages, but there is no direct link to carbon pricing. They do not refer directly to emissions, and there was no competitive element between the subsidies and the carbon prices. In the case of the carbon contracts for differences, it's quite different because they are linked to the differences in the carbon prices. They refer directly to the emissions, and they have a competitive element when carbon prices are increasing in the market. So carbon contracts for differences will be phased out gradually. And the same could be said for the building codes. They have a direct link to emissions, direct link to carbon pricing, but they fail to refer to the direct emissions, and there is no competitive element between the building codes and the carbon prices. The same could be said by the emission performance standards. There's a direct link to carbon pricing, there's a direct reference to the emissions, and there is a competitive element. And let me explain in the case for the performance standards for cars this a little bit more in detail. So emission standards are helpful, but carbon prices is nevertheless essential to address their inefficiencies. What are their inefficiencies? First, they do not incentivize demand reduction. They don't reduce the rebound effect, and they do not create incentives for phasing out older unregulated vintages or cars. And what you can see here in the case of the greenhouse gas emissions from the road transport, so there is only little decline in the transport emissions. In order to do this, carbon pricing has to be linked to the standards. And the nice thing is when carbon prices are increasing over time, the performance standards would no longer be binding and would be automatically phased out to a certain extent. So, and this is the approach to manage the phase out of the standards, contingent on the successful phase-in of the carbon price. And this is an ideal example how to combine this carbon pricing paradigm with the other complementary measures. Now, let me summarize. So there are three important benefits of making carbon pricing a centerpiece. It's increased efficiency, increased cost efficiency. And this is quite important. We need cost efficiency because of our ambitious goals. There's a clear path to net zero, and it can foster a global carbon price regime. And we do not advocate a single worldwide carbon price, would be a complete unrealistic focal point. This is the global carbon price regime could live with differentiated carbon prices, but what we need is, despite of the differentiated carbon prices, a ratchet up of carbon prices. The preconditions for first best carbon prices are not yet met. Sequencing is important, and therefore to ensure the convergence of the mix, at least to move towards the first best in the long run. And how to do this? Start with a separate emission trading scheme for building transport sector, but use carbon price balances to mitigate the price price differentials. Implement the carbon price stabilizer price collar to manage markets' expectation and allow a path of convergence for all the elements and safeguard against the extreme price hikes. A carbon price amplifier in order to ensure that the price gap required to induce investments and innovation is filled. So this is a proposal which wants to reconcile pragmatic consideration with a clear and a coherent vision for the way forward. And we feel this is a necessary precondition for the success of the European Green Deal. Thank you very much.
Yeah, many thanks, Ottmar, and also to Michael and Miriam from PIC for this very clear presentation on the tools needed to make essentially sure that we move from a second best starting point of too low fragmented carbon prices and systems to a first best solution of uniform and effective carbon prices. And I would now like to highlight again that it's possible to put questions into Slido on the with hashtag ETS. So just go to the Slido website if you have questions or comments and put them in there, and I'll try to take some of them in the Q&A session later on. But for now, I would like to invite our commentators to join and discuss with us. And the first is Beatrice Jordi. Beatrice is a director at the European Commission's DG Klima, and she's responsible there for European and international carbon markets. So she is the one that will ultimately have to come up with proposals on how to make the ETS fit for 55, but also for 100, as Ottmar said. And so, Beatrice, we would be excited to hear your thoughts on the paper and maybe the larger architecture that you have in mind.
Many thanks, Georg. I hope sound is correct. Super. So very happy to be with you, and a very pertinent and healthy debates. We are in the middle of Fit for 55 preparation. I would love that it's only me the one proposing. It will be a commission decision with all the service, and as always as a collegial proposal that of course it will be discussed by Parliament and Council. So many thanks, Professor Edenhofer, very interesting. Just to highlight that the Fit for 55 is a big change of league, it's a big change of dimension. So we have been ambitious in the past, but now the 55 requires an integral approach, mainstream approach, from trade policies to fiscal policies to energy, climate, all the fronts active there. It will clearly have an impact, and it will have a consideration on distributional and equity aspects, not only at member state level, but also at citizen level, and how we will handle that. This will be also part of the discussion. It's this morning prices were at 39 euro. So I think that in the graph, we give a very long range of time, true, But since the last reform in 2018, that Peter Liese was an active member there in this reform, we have jumped from €5 to €39. MSR did that work. So we have been last year, we have €25, and an important clarification is that carbon prices have resisted the COVID crisis, sorry. So prices have been reacting very well. We didn't have any big problem despite the tough situation of the whole economy. So we are now in this Fit for 55, expanding and reinforcing. It will be a land, sea, and air approach. So we will be all over, but we are not alone. So ETS, and I'm jumping in the comments on the paper. So the backstop, I don't love the expression. It is a little bit protective, if I could say. I think that ETS is a pillar, and it will be a pillar. It was a pillar in the last years. And this is because it worked very well in the last 4 years. This is why the Commission is proposing why not to expand into sectors that they are not performing as well as we would like building, like road transport, and like maritime. So I prefer the pillar expression. In the quantity, I mean, in the how to intervene, let me call for caution here. We are talking about MSR. It has been work as a volume mechanism, stabilizing. So why to change that? It has been working, it's working. So what we will have on the table is a possible review of the market stability reserve. Shall we modify the intake rates? Shall we keep it at 24%? Shall we put any dynamic parameters there? Shall we tackle differently the cancellation, that we have a rather popular approach there, saying that please, it's working. So we have a large majority in our public consultation backing the MSR as a good mechanism. So a bit cautious here on intervening in the market. On the building and transport separated markets, it is a clear option on the table. We have also the merge, but it's true that a separated building and transport offers different positive aspects. We can have a transition phase in a separated ETS. We know that the price signals are very different in transport and building than in industry and power. We know that the elasticities of the market reactions are different. So building and transport as separated is a strong option on the table. The last point, the amplifiers. I think that even if I'm director of ETS, I tend not to be egocentric with our instrument. I think ETS is fantastic. We have internalized an externality in the economy, but we need a lot of neighbors. And this is why the Fit for 55 is also pushing for renewables, pushing for energy efficiency, for car standards, for CBAM, a possible border mechanism, and more. And we will keep this band of instruments because we will need reinforcements. You mentioned, Professor Edenhofer, renewables, and clearly renewables have other advantages in security of supply or other sources, energy sources on the table. But just as a tip, I mean, in 2019, pre-COVID times, the power sector decarbonized 15%, so 15% reduction of emissions. We know that ETS is working very well in putting coal out of the energy mix. It's not as strong with gas, but this mix of renewable and carbon pricing have worked very well, to put it like that. So on the amplifiers, clear, we will need amplifiers. To link them to a carbon pricing, to me, sounds a good theoretical exercise, but a very difficult practical exercise. So I think that we should not connect everything to the carbon pricing, but have a mechanism like MSR. Shall the MSR be reviewed or not? That take into consideration all these parallel strengths of different instruments. These are my first reactions.
Many thanks, Beatrice. This was very helpful. I think it gave a bit of view from also the one here heard very clearly where you come from with your points, and I think it's very helpful to reflect on why to some degree our paper wants to go a bit further than what the current architecture of the Commission is. But it was also interesting to hear at which areas you already see that the Commission wants to go beyond the status quo in significant steps. So maybe with to collect some more comments, I would like now to give the floor to Dr. Peter Liese. Dr. Liese is a German member of the European Parliament for the EPP, and both in German and in European politics, he worked on emission trading quite substantively. So we would be excited to hear your thoughts on what's next for the ETS.
Yeah, thank you very much for this invitation, and thank you very much for the presentation of this interesting study. You know, this will be the next big challenge for the European Union, for the Parliament. How can we achieve this quite ambitious 2030 target of 55%? And how huge the effort is. You can see when we look at what has been done in the last 30 years. So from 1990 to 2020, we have reduced emissions by 25%. We had all the benefits from the renovation of the economy in Eastern Germany, in Eastern Europe, and still we only got 25%, which means we need to do more emission reductions in the next 9 years than we managed in 30 years. And I was around in the Parliament, and I know how difficult it is to introduce measures and to strengthen them. So that won't be an easy task, but I think it's possible. I strongly support the European Commission, as does my group. We are in favor of the 55%, and we think it's realistic. And we also think that it's important to integrate the things in the strategy now. But we shouldn't overestimate the effect of the things. Maybe Beatrice Jordi can confirm that if we don't do additional efforts, the things will not be available. So we need to invest in forest, in agriculture, climate-friendly agriculture, and also technology. So the things will not develop by itself. So there is a huge effort. And that's why we were skeptical with the 60%. Let's see how the trialogue will come with an proposal. Very important in the mandate of the European Parliament for the climate law, and I'm very happy that we succeeded. It was an EPP amendment, but supported by Renew and the S&D group. We will not rely only on the existing instruments. So we cannot just increase the effort sharing or the climate action, as it's called now, in each country by the equivalent of an increase of 15 or even 20% with the new target. We need to be more European. And the Parliament clearly said that we want market-based measures. And that's why I think the Commission has support here also from the Parliament. And I very much agree with what Ottmar Edenhofer said also in another meeting. If we don't do the market-based measures, it will be almost impossible to achieve the target, because you cannot imagine that command and control measures will be successful. Now, when I'm open, and there will be a debate on increasing CO2 standards for cars, but when you see the effect, it is minor compared to what we need to achieve. So, and you cannot, first of all, you cannot ban all the combustion engine by 25 or so, and you cannot prohibit the people to use their car when they already bought it. And that will immediately have consequences, so that you need the incentives. You need market-based measures to give the price signal to people, not only to develop more clean cars, but also to use their car more efficiently, to go to public transport, to have video conferences as we do it today. And that is not possible by command and control only. That's why market-based measures are, I'm really convinced, the only solution to really achieve our ambitious targets. That doesn't mean that we don't need additional measures. I fully support Frans Timmermans when he said we need a policy mix, but this policy mix needs to include market-based measures at a larger scale than it is now. And I cannot underline enough that, in fact, the ETS works. You know, I was suffering from the whole history of the ETS. The Parliament, when we introduced the ETS, we already, in the beginning, in our first drafts, we asked for auctioning and for benchmarks, but the Council insisted at that time on free allocation without a benchmark, and that was the first mistake. Then we had many other mistakes, but finally we managed. And it's really important what Beatrice Jordi said, that even before COVID-19, ETS made the emissions go down in the power sector. So those who say ETS didn't work, they refer to the past. And we just should not repeat the mistakes that we have made in the ETS, which already exists, when we consider new market-based measures for Europe. I'm, like the big majority in the Parliament, not in favor of merging the two schemes. I think it's not realistic that there is any support for the European Parliament for one single scheme now. We need two different schemes, but I think it's important not to speak about buildings and transport, but heating and transport. We have a quite significant part of the economy that is not covered by the ETS yet, because it's small installations, but which is using heat, process heating in SMEs. And if we do it for transport, if we do it for building, including individual buildings, we should also include the process heat. Otherwise, we don't have a comprehensive approach. But these two sectors should be in a separate scheme compared to the ETS that we already have. And my last point, it is a challenge. We will have increased prices for heating for private people. We will have increased prices for gasoline and diesel. And that's why we need to address these concerns. So I don't think there is any alternative for carbon pricing, also in these sectors, for strong carbon pricing. But that's why the Parliament, and it was an EPP amendment, introduced the idea of a strong solidarity mechanism. And that includes solidarity between member states. There are challenges for Central and Eastern European countries, but also inside the society. There needs to be a mechanism that poorer people that have relatively high costs for heating and maybe have an old car and cannot replace it soon, that there is a mechanism of solidarity. The price signal must still be there, but we need to enable people to cope with the price signal over time. And I think that is a good package. And I hope, first of all, in the climate law, this amendment will be supported by Council and Commission. And finally, we will have a proposal of the European Commission, which then is also agreed in the co-decision by Council and the Parliament. I think there are problems, there are challenges, but without carbon pricing, also in the area of heating and transport, we will just not make it, and we need to make it.
Many thanks, Dr. Liese. it's very helpful that you clarify that it won't be easy, and that we will need strong tools, and that those tools should be European and market based. And I think that fits very well with the proposal that Meidenhofer presented. Now, I would like to first highlight that the discussions on Slido are going quite well. So we have a lot of discussion going on there. And then I would like to give the floor to Sam van den Plas. He is now Policy Director at Carbon Market Watch, which is a Brussels-based climate NGO. And before Sam worked at the WWF on similar topics, so he knows the ETS inside out. So Sam, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Georg, and thank you for Bruegel in organizing this event, and congratulations on the publication of your paper today. I'm glad to be here and join this distinguished panel for a very timely discussion. I believe we now have a decade and a half of carbon pricing experience in the European Union. And I think it's fair to say between theory and practice, there's still a large gap which needs to be closed. In the ideal economic model, the carbon price would solve a lot of our problems and a challenge basically of achieving net zero decarbonization by the middle of the century. And cost-effective CO2 emission reduction options are discovered by the market along the abatement curve. Now, in practice, it has been different, and I believe it's fair to say it will continue to be different, because there are non-market barriers, availability and the cost of capital, support for clean, innovative technologies which are needed, including addressing split incentives between the owner and the one who pays the energy bills. And I think it's good you recognize several of those challenges in the paper as well. I think in this context, it's also very helpful to see or to hear Beatrice Jordi speaking about a pillar, because without having multiple pillars in place, your house will effectively collapse. And I think it's what we need to try to do in the context of the climate policy making going forward as well. After all, I mean, getting greenhouse gas pollution down to where it needs to be, it is a very complex task. And it requires many instruments in the policymakers' toolkit, not just a one-size-fits-all approach. So I want to comment a bit more on the details of addressing additional sectors under the ETS or in a separate scheme. And we fully support the very cautious approach here, because we were very mindful that fully including sectors like transport and buildings or heating and transport is complex and politically sensitive, and it's important to get it right. We have come out of almost a decade of very low carbon price signal in Europe. I'm personally not too worried about upsetting the market and creating a rapid rise in the carbon price, but rather the downside risk. If it's not correctly calibrated, then there's also potential for crashing the carbon price a second time, and that would be very unfortunate. We believe also, when we want to encourage citizens who are heating their homes, who are driving their cars to work, it needs to address the barriers for them to be able to move to cleaner technologies. And for example, if we establish a 50 euro per ton carbon price in the transport sector, at the pump, for the car owner filling up with petrol, it would increase the petrol price by about 10 euro cents per liter. So it's not much, even if you have very high carbon prices. Similar problems arise when someone is renting a house and paying for the energy bills, would see increased carbon pricing added to their energy bills. They need to have the possibility to also invest in the insulation. Now, if you're not owning the house, that is a major barrier, and there are split incentives there. So we do think it is important that measures like CO2 standards, efficiency standards for buildings can work hand in hand with enhanced carbon pricing. And yes, we are very mindful, and I believe you outlined that very correctly in your paper as well, that this needs to be a socially fair instrument as well, especially citizens who do not have the ability to move to a cleaner alternatives, but are forced to pay a higher price. That needs to be avoided at all costs. For us, and then I speak on behalf of a wider group of NGOs, a bigger concern to an underlying concern to this discussion has been the fate of the effort sharing regulation and the nationally binding climate targets. We have been involved in a campaign. More than 45,000 European citizens have replied to the European Commission public consultation, and I apologize, I hope we didn't inundate DG Klima and colleagues there with too many of the same replies, but it was very important to make clear that we cannot afford in times of a climate crisis to do away with nationally binding climate targets. It needs to go hand in hand with strengthening sectoral policies, but also ensuring that member states ultimately retain the incentive to take national action to decarbonize those sectors going forward. And then I want to wrap up with saying some final words on the carbon price amplifier. I strongly support your ideas to trigger more investments in clean innovation and technologies, and having that as an additional component to stronger carbon pricing. But I do have to address an elephant in the virtual room here, which is also the perspective of the externalities. And there is a gaping market failure enshrined within the European emissions trading system currently, and it is the free emission allowances. If you allow me, there are a lot of external costs which are not yet internalized in the European emissions trading system currently. When this decade is over, under the current legislation, European industry could have received over 400 billion euros worth of freely allocated European emission allowances. In the coming decades, it's around 6.5 billion emission allowances, which can still be given away for free up to 2030. And it's not efficient. It's not economically efficient. And I think it's untenable I'm not saying you do that, but it's untenable to keep defending this practice of handing out free emission allowances. And these are not just the NGOs saying this, it's also confirmed by the European Court of Auditors end of last year. They presented the report saying that a lot of these free emission allocations do not reflect sectors' ability to pass through costs. Therefore, windfall profits are generated. It needs better targeting. And we believe also the next review round for the ETS should ultimately lead to the phase out of all free emission allowances. And on a final thought here is also, I think we need to have a discussion also what to do with the revenues ultimately. How are they smartly reinvested in the economy to drive further emission reductions, to adjust the social transition equity principles, and even international climate finance commitments. The European Union is also still lagging behind on those, and putting a price on pollution and smartly reinvesting them from our perspective is the wise thing to do. I look forward to the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Many things then. I have to say we at the beginning of doing the paper, we had a lot of those questions also in mind, and so it kind of we want kind of the all-encompassing field theory of everything, but then we thought it is better to focus on some paradigmatic questions, because we understand that recycling question, free allowances, carbon border adjustment, the level of the price, and so on are all very important in the political discussion to come. But that's not this paper. In this paper, we wanted to come up with a broader architecture. Now, I would suggest the following. I would like to give the floor to Ottmar Edenhofer to pick up on some of your comments and to make his points there, and then I would give to the panelists each some kind of mirror those points back, and also add some additional points that I got from the discussion online. So Ottmar, the floor is yours.
Yeah, Georg, thanks. Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this very valuable comments. Let me start picking up from Beatrice Jordi a few aspects here. You said you do not really like this idea of the backstop. You prefer the notion of pillar. That's fair enough. But I would say it's good to provoke you a little bit, because it seems to me then at least carbon pricing should become a stronger pillar in the whole policy package, because I deeply believe this is not just an issue to get a little bit efficiency gains here and there. I deeply believe that carbon pricing is necessary in order to achieve the minus 55 and in the end carbon neutrality. A bigger issue and a much more broader issue is this idea of the price collar. And I know that in the Commission the price collar has not a fan club. I understand this. And I also accept and agree that the market stability reserve created to a certain extent the scarcity. But at least what I would say is, when we have two separate systems, then you would need a market stability reserve in the new system. And nevertheless, I would say a carbon price collar is much more effective to stabilize the expectations of the traders. And I know all the problems of the implementation, but we as academics, we are not forced to think only in the very short term, but we could broaden a little bit the perspective. And here I would like to advocate the price collar idea, at least in the midterm, in order to make a good, let's say, create good focal points for interventions in the market. One aspect I would like to highlight is, of course, when we said we want, or we propose a second system, we have in end an upstream system in mind, where basically all coal, oil, and gas is included. That this could help to start here with this upstream system. So with Peter Liese, I fully agree that the exclusive, so we cannot just rely only on the performance standards and on direct regulation. I think that's the main thing, and this is something which we have to address in the end. You also mentioned in some of your interventions this problem of an upstream system, but I think that seems to me would be the way to go. I have a lot of agreement with Sam van der Plas, of course. So there is, we also agree that we need a policy mix. We see that in particular, when we talk about this new system, distributional issues are much more challenging, because we impose costs on the consumers, and this has to be handled in a reasonable way. The last thing what I would like to emphasize, I am in full agreement with free allowances. Of course, auctioning of the allowances is the way to go. And then the fate of the effort sharing regulation. I think the effort sharing regulation could be combined or designed in a way which is fully consistent with the second ETS. There are many ways, and my interpretation is that to a certain extent, the effort sharing regulation is a kind of a complementary measure. When it is well designed, it can work very well together with this new second ETS system.
So I would essentially pass it back to Beatrice Jordi and maybe highlight the last point again, because that has also been discussed in the chat. So Anna Gumbau from Carbon Pause, for example, asks the same question: what would the proposed separate ETS for the two sectors mean for national targets under the effort sharing regulation? Should those be scrapped? Maybe you can say a few words on what the thinking of the Commission is there.
Well, I'm afraid that due to the time of thinking, I'm condemned to be a good diplomat and not go to the point. I can say to Sam that we got his message, that's in the public consultation. So we have taken good note of that. And clearly, well, it's an interesting debate. We will come with our proposal, but an important point of the Fit for 55 is that there's no backsliding. in what we were proposing. And this will be our philosophy. Our creativity will be there with your help, but it's not that instruments that or responsibilities of member states or other type of instruments like the Energy Efficiency Directive or other instruments will be backsliding. So the backsliding principle is there. Just to comment to all, I fully agree that that market-based measures are sine qua non. So Professor Lise absolutely fully agrees. It's sine qua non, but we need others helping us in this decarbonization path and change of society and economy. That is at the end the Green Deal. We have none of us mentioned the recovery package, and I would like to mention that. The injection in the economy of 750 billions, the way that this injection and the way that this investment are going to be done, it will change enormously what is the extra effort to decarbonize. So a plea to member states and also a plea to ourselves, because the Commission is having a good look there to the recovery package on how this is invested. In foster innovation, I've forgotten, but it's a must. If we need to foster innovation, you know that the Innovation Fund, part of the ETS, it was out of the last reform, is having an enormous success. And of course, the big research program of the Commission should be there and more. So carbon contracts for differences and other type of instruments there. Just to mention the free allocation. It's an elephant in the room, but we have been discussing on free allocation in the last co-decision days and nights. So it is true that as you see a very fast path decarbonizing of the power sector, the industry is in a much shy effort, even if you have industries like fertilizers or chemical industry that are presenting a much better decarbonization path. But we cannot deny the international competition, and that's from countries that they do not have in place climate policies. So I think this is the healthy debate also that CBAM is putting on the table. And we have some meetings with third parties that are worried about CBAM, but this is it. So free allocation, of course, is going on. Carbon leakage is going to be discussing our next proposal, and that's all from my side, Georg.
Thanks, Beatrice. Then I would like to go to Peter Liese and maybe also ask him the question on kind of the working together of the ESR and an extended ETS. So whether you have some views on that. And there was well, there were many interesting questions, but one question that I would have picked up as well was by Hermann Wolleberg, who said that essentially asking himself whether we cannot continue with the energy taxation directive simply in the non-ETS sector and try to strengthen that. Would that not be the more elegant way? I hope I interpreted this question correctly.
Yeah, maybe starting with the last point. The problem in Europe is that for any regulation on taxation, you need unanimous vote. And that's why I think it's a lost case. We can try, but we tried already. You know, I was elected to the European Parliament in '94. And at that time, I was strongly advocating a CO2 tax. But it just didn't work out because the unanimous vote didn't happen. And at that time, we were only 15 member states. And now we are 27. This is even more difficult. So the beauty of the ETS is that it's an environmental measure and it can be voted by qualified majority. And the advantage is you have a more targeted instrument, which means you will really achieve the target. A tax can always be too high. You overachieve the target, but you overburden the citizens, or it's too low, and then we won't achieve the target. And the ETS will deliver the price by the market. And technology will, of course, be enabling us, that's the main point, we need innovation, and the ETS will trigger that innovation. Maybe two short reactions on the other points that has been mentioned on the free allowances. EPP is strongly in favor of being here very careful. And Sam van der Plas mentioned this, a better targeting. Okay, that's what also the Court of Auditors said. Let's look at this, but a complete phase out would really endanger the competitiveness of the European industry. And we need to lead by example. We need to convince other major economies to follow us. And by a hasty phasing out, that may be endangered. And we are just voting today on the CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. The devil is in the detail. We will not have a carbon border adjustment mechanism by next year or 23 that completely protects every sector. We need to go step by step and see how far we can go also under WTO rules, what are the reactions from third countries. So if we do it too fast and too hasty, that's a problem. And with the higher target, the pressure will anyhow increase. So the pressure on industry to innovate is there. And that's why we need to be careful here. On Next Generation EU, Beatrice, it's completely right. That is a good tool, but I'm not yet convinced that the member states are really doing what they should do. So there's a lot of window dressing, there's a lot of other agenda. So at the moment, Next Generation EU mainly means the next generation has to pay the bill. It is not yet sure that the investment of Next Generation EU will address the problems of the next generation. So, and I think especially young people need to shout out and say, it's our money, please spend it on purpose. And last point on the effort sharing or climate action regulation and how it plays together with the complementary new instruments. Speaking as a German member of the parliament, I know how ambitious the existing 2030 target for Germany is. We are not yet there. And that's why I not think it's realistic to say we just do 15% more or even 20% more and let's see how we do it. It will also be always the issue of competitive disadvantage from one member state to the other. And when we have a European problem, we should also use European instruments. But that doesn't mean, in my view, to abolish effort sharing or climate action regulation, but at least to keep it as it is, so that member states have their efforts and they should follow the policy instruments that they have already introduced. And on top of that, we got more European instruments. That would at least be my starting point.
Many thanks. I would have a request to some that we don't dive too deeply into the discussion on CBAM, even though it's a discussion of that is political today and topical today as well, but try to stay a bit on the broader question of the ETS architecture. And one question that came up repeatedly also in the chat was, and I think it was also mentioned during our panel session already, is the question of the price levels in the transport and heating might be significantly higher than for the industry and electricity side. And so, do you think that there is some political feasibility for accepting these two very differentiated prices, or will there be some kind of political force to pull them together?
Sorry, was that to me, Georg?
Yes, indeed.
Sorry, I didn't get that. Well, I think in the context of these price levels, what is really important to understand what type of change it can drive in those sectors. And I gave some of the examples because not only we're dealing with rather inelastic responses. So as the carbon price goes higher, there won't be so much reduction in demand from those sectors. There's a second effect which plays, is that the fuels which are used in these sectors, be it in transport and be it in buildings, are already heavily taxed. Not always with a carbon price component, but because you have duties and levies on transport fuel, because you have distribution charges in the electricity bill. This is where practices between member states, especially for households in the building sector, vary widely. The Regulatory Assistance Project last week published some data showing that between the Netherlands and Belgium, for example, there's a factor 5 difference between how electricity and gas is priced for the end consumer and what the charges and the levies are on top of that. So in order to correct this, yes, I agree with Mr. Liese. National taxation policies, I mean, there you would need unanimity at European level, and it becomes a lot bigger challenge than improving the ETS by qualified majority, which is already a major task in itself. So those are some of the challenges there, where to be clear, we're not opposing improved carbon pricing, pollution pricing for those sectors, but it needs to be also clear what are going to be the real life impacts, because we're basically establishing this in a situation where it's going to demand a lot more from the whole society to be mindful of their carbon footprint, of their CO2 impacts, to invest in clean solutions. And this is also where I believe the fairness component needs to come in, not only for the redistributional effects, but I will also, I'm sorry to get back on my hobby horse right now, but this is where it needs to be fair for all sectors, including energy intensive sectors, by allowing them not to pay for the large majority, and it's currently around 95% of the emissions which are for free to those sectors. It will go down slightly in the coming decade to 90, 80%. But there also, I'm pretty sure that citizens would expect all sectors to do their fair effort.
Somewhat more academic, but I think also very relevant, is a question about well, carbon prices to a certain degree are there to optimize intertemporally the decarbonization pathway. And if we anyway have to be to net zero in 2050, I understand the question as asking to which degree we should kind of put so much focus on the carbon price pathway and optimizing and trading if we know that by 2050 the volume should be zero anyway.
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Now here I would like to respond in the following way. First of all, even if we have carbon neutrality by 2050, net neutrality, this does not mean that the carbon price will become zero. The carbon price will not become zero, right? And because either we have to deal with the negative emission issue, and also so there will be some carbon price level in order to facilitate and to make the fossil fuels underground expensive enough. There will be an incentive, for example, if you think about the hydrogen strategy, or to use carbon from burning fossil fuels. So we have to incentivize for the synthetic fuels that carbon is not used from burning fossil fuels, but from direct air capture or from biomass. And for all that, we need that incentive. So net neutrality by 2050 does by no means mean or imply a carbon price of zero. That's number one. And the second aspect is this issue of intersectoral efficiency. And we have discussed this today. And here I would like to highlight a few things. First of all, we all agree that the abatement costs, the marginal abatement costs in transport, heating, building sector are probably higher, at least higher than in the energy and in the industry, at least in the energy. So carbon prices make these costs transparent. But if you need all the complementary measures, the costs will not disappear. There is no machinery, there is no black hole, which basically makes the costs that the costs will disappear. So in that sense, I would say the intersectoral issue remains an important issue. And if we accept that, so the elasticity in the transport sector might be lower than in the other sectors, but by the way, I would say the elasticity of carbon pricing in the transport sector is grossly underestimated. There's much more elasticity in the system than people think, which would be good. But in the end, what I'm saying is that complementary measures has also the performance that they have their costs, and carbon pricing makes the whole thing, first of all, transparent, and at least it allows us to raise the revenues, which then helps us and enables us to support, for example, low-income households. And when you basically are in a situation where you have such huge price differentials of marginal abatement cost curves, so people will realize at this ambition level the costs, and policymakers have to deal with this, and they deal better, from my point of view, in a transparent way. So I'm not saying we need a unified carbon price immediately. That's not the point, but we need a convergence to the carbon price, and it is worthwhile to come up intertemporally and intersectorally gradually to set the whole system towards a much more efficient and also a just and equitable pathway.
Many thanks. I think that is really the point of the paper, that the idea is long-term convergence. So that is that we are unable to and that it's impractical to start out with the first best option. And we had strong discussions also inside Bruegel about this. We want to be in the first best world immediately, and how to essentially justify that we are deviating with our proposal from a first best world, but trying to line out the pathways to get there, and establish clear mechanisms that ensure that that the system can only move in the right direction over time. Now, with that, I think the time of our event is almost over. If there are any hands from any of the panelists that wants to say one last statement, there would be time for that. Maybe some. And
yes, if I may, I wanted to make one remark. Also taking a slight step back from just the cheapest available abatement first, because and it will be strange for an NGO focusing on carbon pricing to say this, but it's not only about tackling the climate crisis. We do know that by implementing the solutions that we need to do this, it will reduce greenhouse gas pollution, and rightly so, but it will also help to create co-benefits across the board. And this is about environmental impacts, it's about cleaner air, cleaner water, biodiversity, etc. But it's also about the social impacts of creating decent, sustainable jobs in the European Union. And ultimately, this is also, if you look at industrial decarbonization and the challenge there, for example, focusing on options like circularity, doing more with less primary product has huge emission reduction abatement potential. But in order to capture that through one carbon price, there's still a very long way to go. So, and I think we are all very mindful of those issues kind of outside of the climate policy making sphere. but I think that's also a big challenge for the coming Fit for 55 package and the implementation thereof, to make sure that we tackle those things hand in hand and moving forward in the same direction.
Ottmar, you wanted to say something? Okay.
No, I said almost everything. So, but so as the final word, so I think, of course, there are. I couldn't agree more that there are many other externalities, and you touched also this issue of energy taxation. But indeed, so here I would say the advantage of the second emission trading scheme would be that under this cap, the reform of energy taxes at the national would be then feasible, and to adjust the energy taxes in an appropriate way to a more carbon-based, towards a more carbon tax base. So this would be, from my point of view, also one of the advantages, that you have the cap, and then you can adjust step by step at the national level the complementary measures. Yeah, so I think that's what I would like to say. I would like to thank for this really lively and very helpful debate, and thank you very much for the comments to our paper.
So then also from my side, first of all, a big thank to the panelists for taking the time and making this event very lively and very interesting to me. So also for opening up to new topics that we might want to explore deeper. I also like to thank the audience that has been also very active, and hope to get potentially also some more feedback via emails and other channels on the paper to see how useful it has been. And I think the PIC and the MTC will continue to work on many of the detailed questions, and will feed into the discussion on a fascinating and ambitious agenda of this year in terms of climate policy. I think there's a lot of much more interesting work to come here, and also Bruegel will continue to contribute its elements to the architecture. So we will have something in the pipeline on CFDs, on hydrogen, and other things. So stay tuned, and thank you very much to all of you, and looking forward to see you hopefully soon physically in Brussels at some point. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Stay safe.
Yeah, thanks a lot.